Welcome back to another episode of Tech Talks Daily. Now, after learning how HarperDB's technology is transforming their business and their technology is changing other companies in unique and innovative ways, you may remember that back in July, I spoke to their CEO, Stephen Goldberg, on the podcast. And I think it was episode 2028, so check that out. It's a great story. But today, I've invited Jaxon Repp onto the podcast to share his story and offer a different angle, because Jaxon has over 25 years of experience architecting, designing and developing enterprise software. And he's also the founder of tech startups and has consulted with multiple Fortune 500 companies on everything from IoT and digital transformation initiatives. But ultimately, this partially reformed developer understands what it's like to wrestle with technology instead of just benefiting from it. And I also love how he passionately believes if the Jetsons never had an episode where a config error brought down a food-o-Matic, it shouldn't be a problem now, should it, 50 years later? He's a great guy, so buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Denver, where Jaxon is waiting to share his story. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Jaxon Repp. I am the SVP of Product Marketing and Delivery at HarperDB. And as a partially reformed developer, I try to focus every day on taking the incredibly complex art of distributed computing and distributed data and make it easy for our developer, for our customers, for our internal employees. I try to make it look like magic. That to me is kind of the art of being in a startup. Anybody can design something that accomplishes, an end goal, but to make that a product, to make that something that you can truly sell and other people look at it and say, that's better than all of the other ways that I've tried to accomplish thing X. That is a challenge that wakes me up every day. This is my 8th startup. I've had only 2 exits and 5 opportunities for learning. I have a folder of things I have a folder of equity that has not yet bought me a Ferrari. And I've had that folder for so long that I am at the age now where I realize what a terrible, I would never buy a Ferrari. Any of these things pay off. There will be no Ferraris. Where would the kid seats go? Where would the car seats go? Right? I'm not going to buy a Ferrari. So it's been an extremely interesting journey, building things from absolutely nothing to solve, on many occasions, a problem that I invented in my own head. But in some very real world cases like this, solving a problem of latency in an increasingly data-driven world.
And I love the line you used there about a reformed developer. And also something I always say on this podcast is too often, I think we only focus on the people enjoying the success at the summit of that mountain, but not the climb. And you mentioned 8 startups there, 5 exits and 2 lessons learned. Did you learn more from the other 2 than the 5 exits? I'm curious, is there a balance there on what you learned the most from?
Oh, well, let's be super clear. I had 2 exits. And 5 opportunities. There's so much more learning than there is actual success. Yeah. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson, right? Is that even the best idea doesn't necessarily get to win because there are so many other things that go into it. And I think the biggest lesson from those 5 startups that failed to launch was the team. Who are the people in your neighborhood? Who are the people that are going to help you ride this ride? And charisma is incredibly compelling. And when I was a lot younger, I would pick up the flag of anybody who had a decent idea that I believed in and had reasonable amount of charisma, because I thought that would translate to sales. But ultimately, if you're not very specifically talented in the areas that you need to be talented for the company to succeed, and you're not sufficiently humble, ability to recognize where you're not an expert and you need to hire somebody or turn those responsibilities over. And I am as guilty of it as anybody. It's truly the team that makes the startup work or not work. And I'm fortunate in my current situation at HarperDB to be surrounded by a team that, to a single employee, if it's within their ability and I ask them to do something or I need them to do something, and likewise, I think this of me, I hope they think this of me. I know that it will get done to the standards that we all hold in common. There's not one slacker in this company, and it's an amazing feeling, and it's so different from every other place I've been. So it's magic you won't recognize, but going forward, and I have friends who have multiple, successful exits, and they back me up on this. It's once you feel that, you will chase that for the rest of your life.
Love that. And something that really stands out there from what you were talking is, I had Stephen Goldberg on, your CEO, a few months ago, and obviously he came from a very big corporate background, and he worked for places like Red Hat, etc., and some big organizations. And you seem to have come from a startup background, and the company Harper is growing continuously at the moment. I'm wondering if there is some kind of culture clash there. Do you go small startup and keep that culture, or do you go big, or is it a big? Do they meet in the middle somewhere? What's happening there, and how are those different aspects colliding?
It is interesting. Stephen and I often go into sales presentations, and I remember one we did years ago, and we came out of it, and he was like, "How do you think that went?" "I think that went really, really well." And I was like, "I think I never ever want to present with you ever again." And I had 10 slides, and I wanted to get through my slides, and the 10th slide was his, and we discussed it. But he got so excited that he jumped in on like 8.5 and took over. And I was just like, And we sat down, and we brought in another salesperson that worked for the company. None of us liked presenting with the others, and we sat and we realized that the other salesperson was your best friend. Like he would be your friend. He would go to your house. He'd barbecue food with you. He knew all your kids' names, and he knew all your problems. And when one of those problems sort of resonated with the solution that we had, he was there, and you trusted him immensely. But it just felt so slow to me, that long relationship building process. I would build a 10-page deck, and I was a lawyer. And by the time I was completed my 10th slide, you would vote to convict yourself to purchase my product, because I laid out all the reasons, and it was unassailable. And Stephen was the hype man. He's the guy that gets up there and he's like, "It's the best thing. You can't afford not to." And I realized as soon as we vocalized it, as soon as we put that out there, what our personalities were and what was driving us, like he literally saw that my argument was 85% of the way. Like it was going well. They were nodding, and he jumped up, and he was, and I took that the wrong way. And I realized now, like, was Chuck D angry when Flava Flav got up and spun the clock around and was like, "Yeah." And I'm like, no, Chuck D was like, you bet, right? Yeah. Get the audience hyped up and close them. So everybody has a role, on this island, and maybe I can roll with mine, right? That's the attitude that you take into every meeting. And then, as we begin to grow and we add more people, one of the most interesting things about this was we all happen to have independently taken the Myers-Briggs test, right? ENTJ, ENTP, INT, whatever. All the letters that tell you whether you're introvert or extrovert, whether you're a planner or a judger, or, how your thought process works. And we realized after, as we were sort of adding people to teams and pairing them up or working together on projects, that some of us who maybe were now partially reformed developers, who were ENTJs or INTJs, and we were very, very driven and delivering code, were not, as we moved into sort of more executive and planning, we dropped that J, but we only really truly succeeded and felt like we were nailing it when somebody else that we worked with on our team that was paired with us closely had the opposite letter. So I am an ENTP. I am paired with an ENTJ, and we have made sure that just about every person who is a P has a J. To complement them, to help them, to keep them on track. Whereas the J's grow because the people with P's at the end are thinking bigger picture, right? They're not nitty gritty. They're not super focused on, all of the cogs that need to, fit into a delivery strategy. And that's sort of, whether or not it scales to as large as a company of 100 or 200 people, who knows? But right now we're 20, and it totally works because I think, as I said, it's the team and it's the culture that really matters. And And at this stage in the company, success matters too. So any tricks you can come up with to figure out how to make a small team as successful as it possibly can be, especially as you're adding more new members, to drive that success in the future, we'll take it.
That's incredibly cool. I often say on this podcast that technology works best when it brings people together. But even in big tech companies or small tech companies, it's seldom about the technology, and it's all about the people and getting the right people, which is so difficult now. And traditionally, of course, we've kind of just put everyone in a room or in a team and said, I hope they get along. But there's much more to it than that. So you've noticed a real difference by actually understanding the science behind how people can inspire each other, right?
Absolutely. It's what we do every day is science, computer science. And we spend a tremendous amount of time. We have entire product cycles and sprints dedicated to squeezing out 1 millisecond of latency from a query engine. Like, we are so focused on that you have to believe that there are other parts of a company beyond simply the product. There are salespeople in our company that will deal with a certain type of company, and other salespeople that will deal with a different type, because we understand how they're going to go in. You mentioned that a lot of the founders here come from a very large company, and I come from a smaller startup background, and before that, an agency background. So the way I sell in is very, very different than the consultative, large enterprise selling strategy. And we run into customers who respond to either. And it just depends on who you're going after. How do you tailor that? And in large sales organizations like an Oracle, they are absolutely incredibly effective. It is amazing how good a salesperson organization Larry Ellison builds in every single endeavor. And to be able to identify exactly what moves the needle, exactly what type of person is going to move the needle for that product, for the target client, and be able to build teams around those personality types and those types of interactions and those dynamics between a large company going into a small company versus two massive enterprises deciding to team up and try to solve a really big problem. It takes all kinds, and at the end of the day, it's all about, is it a balance within that organization where everybody feels like they're being heard, they're being seen, and they're able to contribute in a meaningful way. They're not just carrying water for rock stars. We are, as we've been growing, we were interviewing for a head of engineering, and he was talking about his history of building high performing teams, and he said you can have a 10x developer, but you want to surround them with people who aren't 10x so they get better. And sometimes you have two 10x and it'll be clash and it'll fall apart. And he's like, I really focus on that because what I really want is a team that trusts each other and loves each other and blah, blah, blah. And all these things. And I'm on a Zoom meeting with 5 coworkers and this candidate, and he's interviewing, and I'm looking around and I see all of them looking around. I'm like, wait a minute. Are we a high performing team already? I feel like we might be. And it was just one of those incredible moments where you're like, oh, did we luck into this? This is great. Let's not do anything to screw this up as we go forward. So we started to be very introspective about how we got here, what works, what doesn't. And, our theories may or may not work for anybody else, but they seem to be working for us so far.
And for anyone listening that missed the conversation we had with Stephen a few months ago and hearing about HarperDB for the very first time, could you just offer a bit of an overview of the kind of problems that you're solving with technology and how these different personality types within your teams there are helping to solve these problems by coming together?
Absolutely. We are at our heart a distributed database. Mm-hmm. So the idea that by moving data closer to the end user, their experience will be better, right? We've done it with CDNs by moving static assets very close to users and putting servers all around the world. We did it with serverless functions and Lambdas and lots of EC2 or distributed computing where API endpoints are all around and closer to users. But ultimately, the last piece in that puzzle is the database that drives those APIs. that tells you what asset to bring out of the CDN. And if you're still making a large round trip back to a single monolithic data store, and you can have replica sets that you can read from but don't write to, because allowing people to write at multiple points around a data set requires some finesse in terms of reconciling those. And there are also certainly lines of business like finance where we aren't a fit, because reconciling two transactions from the opposite side of the planet at the exact same time could allow people to steal the same dollar at the same moment. So as we solve the problems of distributed computing, and there are literally mathematical theorems that limit what we can accomplish, that say you can't have global consistency without locking out all the rows, or without locking out a row to make a transaction against it. There's simply limits to physics and the speed of light, right? Mm-hmm. And so we deal with those, and we make our best guess as to what the right behavior is, as to what the market will respond to. And we have people who are absolutely focused engineers and who will squeeze out every millisecond, or every nanosecond out of the thing. And then you have people who are in market talking to customers, realizing that for 95% of the use cases in the world, what we call eventual consistency, the idea that you would write to one and it would eventually reconcile across a cluster, is sufficient. So you've got these personalities who would like nothing more than to literally break the laws of physics and overcome the speed of light and instantly allow a database to do everything. And that is their focus. And sometimes you pull them back and say, we need to spend resources more on this thing, which makes it much more usable, much easier. We need to maybe go with a little convention over configuration, because when we go in and we sell ourselves into an organization that uses Oracle, we encounter the DBAs, and the DBAs come out from their holes, and they're like, I want to optimize the query. How do we optimize the query plan? I want to manage the indexes. I'm like, well, we optimize the query automatically, and we index everything by default. But what will I do? I don't have to do anything, right? And so, but there are trade-offs. There are certainly use cases where Oracle is absolutely a better choice. But for lots of things, we are more performant, we're less expensive, we offer a better user experience, a better developer experience. And to be able to balance that, the challenge of performance, absolute performance, screaming performance, highly specialized databases that we want to outperform. And then the idea that it should just work, right? People should just be able to click a button and say, can I have my data, please? And it's there. And all of the magic that's required to make that happen really, really quickly at the edge as just one node of perhaps 1,000. The magic that's required to make that happen every time is complex. And to be honest, as distributed computing grows and the paradigm, it becomes more familiar to people, we'll probably add more levers and more dials and more, things that make Oracle DBAs happy. But right now, it's enough for people just to even conceive of the fact that applications are running and writing data independently all around the globe, and our engine reconciles those so that ultimately you end up with the right data being available to everybody.
Today's podcast is brought to you by our friends at Nextiva and their new Nextiva One system. Have you ever searched endlessly for the conversations thread that you've had with a client or co-worker, only to check 5 apps and still not have the information that you need to complete the task at hand? I'm sure you have, and unfortunately this is the case for many people in the workforce. But luckily, Nextiva One aims to end this painful process once and for all with what they are calling threaded conversations. Threaded conversations let you see the entire call and messaging histories with others, regardless of the tool that you use to communicate, giving you the power to take back your workday and amaze your customers and team. So simplify your business today and get your Nextiva One communication system by simply visiting nextiva.com/tech Talk Daily. Essentially, what you guys are doing here, you're bringing those ideas to life that will impact the world and solve complex problems. And so many different businesses and clients are coming and asking you to do all this. But I'm curious, what keeps you awake at night, and how do you keep your curiosity alive and that passion alive to create these solutions and bring things to life? Because you've got to do a fair bit of work there to keep that fire burning, right?
Truly, given my background as I mentioned, partially reformed developer, right? You're still in that position where if you have a dream, you can create it. Like I could spend my nights and weekends. I don't know, perhaps I'd send my children to an island, to live Lord of the Flies style, and then I would have free time. But I could build something. But increasingly, the things I want to build, the applications that I want to see in the world require almost real-time response from a data set that's contributed to globally, right? I want to build HarperDB and our platform and our global network, our data fabric. I want to build this product in such a way that the people like me, and maybe even someday me, can build the applications on top of it. Because at the end of the day, building software, we are an ingredient, right? We're an ingredient as a data fabric. We're an ingredient in the solutions people build on top. And so that's what's exciting to me as a product person and as a developer who's built things before, is customers come to us and they're like, we want this, but it's too slow. We built it and now we have success, but now it's slow or it's expensive because, oh my goodness, the cloud providers, they charge you so much money for egress, literally getting your data out. It's free to put data in. Yeah. I mean, if that's not the first, the first puff of crack is free, then I don't know what it is, right? Like they are absolutely giving away the first taste of drugs for free. And then eventually your application becomes incredibly successful. And so your cloud bill grows. And Steven's former company, this database, HarperDB, was built because they built a product that was very cool. It was built on AWS. They were spending $7,000 a month. They got a little bit of traction, and they were looking at a $70,000 and then $700,000 a month bill. And the finances didn't work out because vertically scaling, a monolithic database doesn't work financially if you're at the behest of a large, hyperscaler like AWS or Azure or Google. It's hard to make those numbers work at scale. So horizontal scaling becomes the answer, and that's ultimately what HarperDB was built to do.
And we are reaching that time of the year where futurists, technologists, professionals, board members are all playing that game of trying to predict what technologies or tech trends will dominate the headlines next year. But right in the heart of the industry that you're working in here, is there any emerging technologies or trends that excite you, or you're just following closely?
I think machine learning and artificial intelligence is something that we've seen lots of customers build into HarperDB. And we have a feature basically called custom functions that is like lambdas hanging off the side of the database. And so you can build anything there and you have direct access to our data model. So you skip that hop from the API to the core data store. But within those applications, you can build, you can train machine learning on the data that you're storing, and you can build AI to look at sensor data and take actions. And just watching all of the ways the machine learning is changing sort of our customer applications, especially when they have really, really, like nanosecond access to real-time data. You watch that change, and we are constantly looking at that and saying, what decisions that we made in that convention versus configuration, as we're trying to keep it super simple, what ones do we know that we might want to make that lever available? So an Oracle DBA can be happy. But then the other flip side of that is, what ones could we possibly train? An artificial intelligence to look at data around a distributed system and say, you know what, I'm gonna go ahead and remove a bunch of that data. I'm gonna move it over here. I'm gonna change the indexes. I'm gonna I'm going to execute a full text index on this because that appears to be important, or I'm going to let that drop off because it's less important now. How can I reduce, the number of levers by employing some sort of intelligent system that's not just a human written algorithm that inevitably, falls apart down the road, but that would work theoretically for everything, because the goal is usually the lowest possible latency and the lowest total cost of ownership. The best experience for the users, for the developers, and ultimately for whoever's in charge of maintaining this infrastructure. So how can we apply artificial intelligence to our own infrastructure, to our own product, and not just have it be something that our customers are using? That truly interests me and keeps the fire alive for me internally. And then, as the thing that might be built on top of HarperDB and the data fabric, I'm really intrigued with the marketing aspect of influencer culture and the fact that I think it's 87% of purchases are guided by influencers in some way, or affected by influencers in some way. And how does that massively distributed, economy, where how does that scale, and how does it remain performant when perhaps the number of influencers is equal to the number of potential purchasers? Because I think that's where it's going, right? I mean, if you talk to any kid, I have a 7-year-old, and she's convinced that she's going to be a YouTube star.
Wow.
So, how will that scale when every single person is just selling to each other?
Yeah. Well, there's a whole topic for another episode right there. But before I let you go, I appreciate there's probably not too much you can share, but what's your focus going to be for the months ahead? Is there anything that you can share around what you're going to be working on or focusing on at HarperDB?
Absolutely. So at HarperDB itself, our core product is focused, on keeping things simple. And I've spoken a lot about that today.
Yeah.
And as we've gone into market and as we've deployed HarperDB clusters for our customers, we realized that a lot of the niceties that we built into the product, ultimately, when it comes to all of the ways you can deploy it, there are complexities there too. So I think we're working forward on a platform that is almost a single click for a data fabric. So not just instances of HarperDB, which we focus on and connecting them together with our clustering engine, but the idea that instances of HarperDB, might simply exist ethereally to serve your workload and pull back. And how can we automate that? And that's one of the problems we're wrestling with right now and figuring out. It's an extremely interesting problem, and it's going to take a while to figure it out. But like I said, this team is capable of just about anything.
Well, I wish you the best of luck on that journey. I'm looking forward to following you. We'll get you back on next year to find how things are going. Maybe get you and Steve on the same podcast. But before I do let you go, we have a bit of a tradition here on the podcast. I like to have a bit of fun with my guests. So I'm going to ask you now, as a man that's had a very varied journey in tech, from startups to big business, etc., you must have read a lot of books and listened to a lot of songs on your headphones while coding deep into the night. So would you leave everyone listening with either a song that we can add to our Spotify playlist that helps you get your head in the zone or just means something to you, or a book that you would recommend that we can add to our Amazon wish list? All I ask is, what are you going to leave us with and why?
I'm going to choose a book, and I'll choose a book that sort of changed how I viewed and valued reading, because I was always traveling for work, and I would always get some sort of a thriller of Baldacci or right, and I'd read it half on the way out and half on the way back on a sales trip, and I was burning through these things, and I picked up a book by Claire Massoud called The Last Life, and it is beautifully written. It is, the difference between reading a spy thriller like I would normally read and picking up John le Carré, right? The difference in the quality of writing. And The Last Life was about her parents in Algeria, their journey to France to set up a hotel on the coast, and how you looked at where their past affected their present, their attitudes toward each other, toward their children, toward France's attitude toward Algerian immigrants that would dare set up a hotel on the coast. And it was just so beautifully written and immersive that it took me out of, there's no tech. I mean, they barely had running water in this hotel, right? Like that was one of the struggles. But it was internal, and it was beautiful, and it wasn't on the surface. And if you don't read great literature that truly makes you examine stuff beyond, the surface or the action or the political intrigue of the day that you can see on CNN or watch on Fox News, or you'll see that all day, every day. And then you codify this in these historical fiction novels where everybody's fighting and killing all the time. And then you read something that just slows you down so much so that, if you try to do it right away, it'll take you a few minutes to read the first page because you just need to bring it down a notch. It resets yourself. It resets the way you look at the world. There are no short. John le Carré's last book was just published, and it's amazing. And I would recommend it as well. But Claire Massoud, The Last Life, was one of those beautiful stories that just jarred me into a completely different place and allowed me to look at the world from a completely different angle. And I recommend it, all her work. And if you have to stay in the thriller, then Le Carré is obviously amazing.
That is such a powerful answer, and so important as well, especially when most people are scrolling. I include myself on this sometimes as well, where you're scrolling down or doom scrolling your way down a social media feed, which is just acting as a mirror, really, just giving yourself back to you. It's so important to challenge your worldview, and that's how we learn. But before I let you go, for anyone listening, just wanting to find out more information about HarperDB, etc., what's the best starting point, especially if they want to contact your team, etc., or just find out more information about your work?
Sure, absolutely. We can be found online at harperdb.io. And we also have a community Slack if you want to join that, and links to that on our website, as well as a link to spin up a free instance. We have a hosted product as well, so you can spin up a free instance, take it for a test drive. You can always download it and install it for free. We like to think we're the easiest database in the world to use, so it shouldn't be that much for anybody who's tech inclined, and you can join the future with us.
Well, as I said earlier in the podcast, I always say technology works best when it brings people together. And although this is a tech podcast and we've talked a lot about tech today, it's bringing people together, and the right people together. And I love the journey that you've been on, the lessons that you've learned. And you've even taught me something there by recommending that book at the end as well. So I'm going to be checking that out. But more than anything, just a big thank you for taking the time to sit down and share your story with me today.
Well, thank you so much, Neil. I really appreciate it.
Jaxon is a brilliant guy. I could have chatted to him for hours, and there was a few technical issues before we started today regarding meeting links and everything. He was incredibly patient throughout, and ultimately we just sat down, hit record, and started talking. And I think there's something quite beautiful in that. So I cannot thank him enough for his patience coming on here and not just talking about the podcast. We got to know each other a little. We're talking about surfing, that giant wave in Portugal, tech conferences. There's so much more we talked about that didn't make the podcast, but just a big thank you to him for coming on. And just listening to the conversation today, I'm curious, did anything resonate with you? Did it spark any questions or maybe stories that you have that you'd like to share on this podcast too? Whatever it is, please email me now, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilCHughes. We'll keep this conversation going, and I'll return again tomorrow with another guest. So thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.